Welcome to the Remote First podcast. Every week we invite guests from large or innovative companies to share their insights on enabling an equitable and distributed workplace experience. I'm your host, Daphne Laforêt. Hi everyone, this week I have the pleasure to discuss with Samantha Fisher, Head of Dynamic Work at Okta. Sam is definitely someone who works with a people-centric lens and wants to create the best workplace experience, no matter where you're located. So I'm really happy to have her today. Thank you so much for joining, Sam.
Thank you so much, Daphne. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Me too. And I would love for you to give a bit of context about, what is Okta just as a product so people can know a bit more like what company it is and what is the setup with like the amount of employees and then how you're working.
Yeah, so Okta is an access identity company. So many people know it as the two blue circles that intertwine when you try to log on to something. So it's kind of the interface between a customer or a client and their access security. So when someone tries to access their website, or if you're, a lot of people will use it when they do log in for VPN or something like that for our organization. So it really is the gateway and the front door for access security. So that's really what we do. That's what we provide. And then from a company perspective, Okta has just shy of 3,000 people globally located across the entire world. We are located domestically in the US, and then we also have locations in APAC and EMEA.
That's awesome. I really love when, I can get company on board on the podcast like this who have like very, very big companies with a lot of employees and are succeeding at a hybrid workforce. Because right now, this is really what people are talking about. They're trying to move towards a bit more of a hybrid. There's a lot of discussion around this. So I think it's going to be super interesting to hear everything you have to share there. I also actually want to say that you have like 15 plus years of experience in like real estate, workplace, and things like that. And then now you are a head of dynamic work. Can you explain a little bit more, like what does that mean to be a dynamic work compared to like something that's a bit more like workplace only?
Yeah, so the to your point, I've been in real estate for a really long time. I've had the very lovely pleasure of working for leaders who really think about workplace not just as a bricks and mortar and the furniture and the fixtures that you put inside of it. And so coming to Okta has been really incredible because I've been able to take that experience of thinking about a workplace as a place where people come for collaboration and connection. And it's a place where you can have a physical manifestation of your culture and your values and how people interact and work and innovate. And then align that with the actual culture of the organization from a distributed work environment. So the difference or the big differentiator between dynamic work and what I have traditionally done is I've traditionally worked for companies where the organization had a in-office presence with a very small contingent of people that could work remotely. We might have flexible work policies where you didn't necessarily have to come into the office every day, but the expectation was still that you were primarily an office-based organization. The beauty of dynamic work is that we're changing the philosophy of how we think about work in place. And so now instead of workplace being the place you go to get work done, it's just another tool in your toolbox of how you get your work done. And it's a fairly substantial shift from how you think about capacity planning and space planning and design to the tools that we provide our employees to the way in which they manage their workday. And so it's a huge kind of culture lift as well. And what is the employee experience when we no longer require in office presence, which is the main differentiator for dynamic work. We have offices, we plan to maintain offices and have a portfolio where people can go to have connection and collaboration in offices, but there's no longer a requirement for you to come into the office at all if you don't want to. And so that's the big shift from what was traditional workplace strategy or workplace experience to the dynamic work experience.
And then where did that shift happen for you where maybe like naturally your passion was kind of like driven more towards a workplace experience as an experience instead of a location necessarily?
So I actually think that happened for me many, many years ago, long before I ever got into workplace experience. I come from a retail background. So I spent 7 years with a consumer electronics retailer who's no longer around. But I spent it at their corporate headquarters, and we spent a lot of time talking about why do customers come into the store and where do they spend their time, and how do we think about the design and the organization of the store in a way that really supports the way shoppers shop. And so for me, I've always had that lens, even in traditional real estate, which has predominantly been about the core and shell and then the furniture you put in it, and there's been a long standing history of how you design a space. But I've always had a lens around what does that mean for the quote unquote consumer. And so when you're inside an organization and you're working for an organization, my consumer has always been the employee. And so what does that look and feel and manifest itself like? And all of those things are part of an ecosystem. Not There's not one or two or three. You have to think about it like a journey and an employee journey. And there's lots of conversations now about design thinking and how do you do design thinking. But honestly, from my perspective, design thinking is now something that's a buzzword, but it's always been part of how you think about a retail experience for consumers and customers. And so I've just brought that lens with me, and I've been very fortunate to work for organizations that have allowed me and enabled me to think about it like that as an ecosystem. And the beauty of Okta and dynamic work is now there's actually a opportunity for me to not only think about it like that, but be really empowered across a multitude of cross-functional teams to really think about that employee experience in that way.
So it's like now that you were thinking about the customer experience, so like everything now it's like the employee experience. Like what's the employee journey in the workplace basically?
Right. It's a very similar process and practice.
So what does it look like right now at Okta? So you have 3,000 employees across different time zones, across different countries. Some are working in office, some are working from home or co-working spaces. So what is this kind of equitable workplace experience that you're creating at Okta?
So to back up just a little bit, no, our offices aren't open. So right
Not
now,
yet. Yeah, no.
everyone is working
Yeah,
from
yeah, yeah.
right, not
I
yet.
just mean
They
in
actually
general.
open on our yes. So we have domestic offices that will be opening very shortly. But the guiding tenets around dynamic work, which started prior to COVID. COVID actually was not the impetus for why we did dynamic work. The conversation started in early 2019, and it was really around macroeconomic trends, the challenges that we saw for our employees, the continued rise and acclamation of digital natives, the fact that every company can be a technology company. And I just think COVID showed that or the pandemic really showed that in a very visceral way for a lot of companies to see it. And so the challenge for us, and you mentioned the word equity is really important to us when we talk about choice and flexibility for how, where, when you work. The big challenge that's sort of, I like to call it the iceberg, it's the part under the water that people don't necessarily talk about, is that equity. And I've been a remote worker before for companies and had those opportunities where you might be on the phone with a group of people that are sitting in the office, and you might be one or two people remotely, and you don't get a chance to contribute, you don't get a chance to talk. The conversation might happen after the call actually hangs up, and the decisioning, you're not part of the decisioning. And so when we started thinking about dynamic work, those were the big components that we really wanted to make sure was equity for us is really around access and availability to the same resources, to leadership, to opportunities in the organization, to learning, to feeling like you're adding a valuable contribution to the work product that's actually being generated. And so when we think about equity here and how we're designing our environment, and I say that because it's not just the space, it's actually the tools that we use, the practices that we're putting into place, the rules of engagement, for lack of a better term, for how you manage meetings, how do you talk about stuff, all the way through to performance management cycles, are all in an effort to ensure equity across a workforce that is going to flex a lot. Right, we're not going to be the ones that say you have to come to the office 3 days a week, or you have to come to the office on these days, or these people are on this schedule and these people on this schedule. That's not how we're going to design our workforce, and that's really different. And so there's a lot of heavy lifting going on right now internally around what are the best practices for how you run a meeting when you have people that might be virtual, people that might be in person actually in the meeting room, and people that might be at the office but sitting at their desk or
Mm.
sitting at a different work point. And so for us, that's really what that equity means, is equal access, equal availability. How do you open and close meetings? How do you ensure the content and the information that people need is easily and readily findable, because they might be on a different time zone, to your point. Our APAC team might be working on a project with our North American team, and what we don't want is either of those teams to feel like they have to be up working at the time at another time zone. So how do you enable asynchronous working in a way that it just is a continuous loop? And so for us, that's really what equity is about. Is there's no single team that feels like I have to give up something in order to provide good work product, right? I can blend that with my work life based on my time zone or my geography or my culture. And those all the way that we do that is through the tools and the rules of engagement and the best practices and the handbooks that we develop and that we provide to our teams.
That's awesome to hear that, you're at that level of being able to just put everything together and offer that for your team. And what kind of practical or tangible practices could you share a bit of, like, that you're able to do that, what you're preaching for example, let's say with the way you're meeting or the way that you're collaborating.
So we have a couple of tangible ways that we're doing it. I would say one of them is the tools that we're selecting. And that is an enterprise effort around what are the best tools to help people collaborate, to help people share real time information. Obviously, we're a Google work suite. And so but helping people really understand how to use those platforms in a way that they're sharing appropriately, but even down to like some tips and tricks around how do you organize your Google Drive and your folders, and when do you link to slides versus not link to slides so you're not recreating. I mean, it sounds very elementary and fundamental, but I think the thing that organizations really have to focus on is when you're in an office with people and you're co-located with people, whether you're a new employee or a more seasoned employee, you have this natural um, network that is surrounding you physically. And so if you have a question about something, I call it the gopher syndrome, right? You can pop your head up like a little gopher might do and look around and see who's available to talk to. That doesn't exist necessarily in a virtual environment. And there's a lot more intentionality around, okay, I have a question. And you kind of go through this scenario as an employee of, all right, who do I ask? Are they available? What channel do I use to ask them? Am I asking the right question, right? So the level of kind of internal conversation that you have as a distributed employee, when particularly if you're new, to try to figure out like just the basics of how to get your job done is really challenging. And we know from studies, people spend up to 20% of their time, wasted time, trying to figure out how to find and answer those questions. And so while this some of this stuff sounds exceptionally fundamental, it really is, because we've no one has ever really worked this way before.
Hmm.
And the best way for us to enable that is to set some of those really um, fundamental guidelines, even to the point of we're talking about how do you manage a meeting, right? And so we say, hey, here's some pro tips. You open the meeting with the people that are virtual, and you close the meeting with the people that are virtual. And if you have virtual folks, you write their names on the whiteboard if you're in a room, so everybody can see their name, because we don't have the technology yet that takes a single room and turns everybody into their own Hollywood square yet. But that's technology that we're looking at, right? So that's when we talk about equity, it's things like that.
Hmm.
And those best practices that will really enable that equity as we move along on this journey of a dynamic workforce.
And you talk a lot about processes and frameworks and like setting up the right environment, the technology, but don't you think there's a lot to do with it culturally in a company, that it is kind of a big culture effort in a company to make that work?
I do. I think it is. And I think the companies that are, truly value driven, really, and they're built from that, I think it's going to be easier for them. I think and in some ways, I think it's easier for, excuse me, younger and not as big companies to make this shift, right? This is a big It's a big shift, and when you're talking about 3,000 employees, even though that's by no means a small number, it's quite a bit different than 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 employees that you're trying to make this shift with. Okta is, fairly young. I mean, it's 13 years old, so we've done a lot of growing, and we're continuing to do a lot of growth. And so the ability for us to make change is part of our culture. And so people are very comfortable with, being a little bit on the leading edge of things, and knowing that we're making shifts and we're growing in those. And as we grow, the maturation of the organization really is around how do we build this culture of inclusion, culture of equity. What are and the processes are the things that enable that culture, right? So people can, that old adage of culture eats strategy for breakfast every day is totally true. So we could say, this is our strategy, this is our plan. But if as a culture, our leaders aren't living it and aren't showing it, and the way in which we do recognition and rewards isn't aligned with how we talk about what equity looks like, it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
And so for us, it's a two-part piece, right? We have this overarching umbrella of culture. We hired someone who's very much focused on employee experience, that is partner with me around what does that look like for the employees, whether you're distributed or whether you're in office, and how do we bring people together? What are the incentives that bring people together to maintain that culture? And then how do we take that culture and distribute it out? And a lot of that has to do with people's perspective and perception of the ease of access, their perspective and perception around, how, again, rewards and recognition, or when we look at who gets promoted, how do we think about that? So all of those things play into how your culture goes. And so when your processes and your frameworks and your guidelines, whatever we want to call them, are strong and people are bought into them, they manifest themselves in a way that is a visible representation of your culture. And people can say, okay, they tell me that this is what our culture is, these are our values. I can see us living them. I can see it in how the actions manifest themselves based on the culture of how we designed it.
Mm. I think also the psychological safety also that you created a company that would make you comfortable, you know, being working in the open, for example, which is quite useful for. There's many remote companies that actually comes from an open source background, and they were very
Hmm.
successful at it because of that culture, like feeling that you can just work in the open and not feel like you have to control too much of like what's going outside. um Definitely there's so much stuff there. So what do you think, with the experience that you have and what you're putting in place, what do you think will be the most challenging for companies now who are thinking, okay, we're going to try that hybrid thing because we miss the office because we want to see people, but we want to be a hybrid company now because we also want to be cool and competitive, which is usually a reason why they would go for
Right.
that. So like, what do you think will be the most challenging for them?
This might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but I personally think the challenge that a lot of organizations are going to find is the heavy lift of doing the foundational work, right? I look at companies like GitLab and GitHub and some of these companies that have started a little bit more in a remote first environment where they didn't have any physical real estate. And that's not a barrier by any stretch, but I think they did the hard work to figure out what are the processes, what are the tools, what are the ways in which we expect people to work, right? They've kind of defined what that looks like. And for a lot of organizations, nobody has defined what or how work should happen,
Hmm.
right? Whether it's, is it truly 9 to 5, or is it 8 to 5, or is it nonlinear? Is it only in this place? Can you only do this function in this place? Is this job only can be in office, or this job has to be remote? And I don't think a lot of companies have done that organizational design work
Hmm.
and how that's going to then enable a distributed or a hybrid workforce. And I think that's where the challenge is really going to come for a lot of organizations. And I've seen a lot of organizations, including a lot of tech organizations, taking a bit of a step back from where they started the pandemic was, we're going to be fully flexible
Hmm.
or fully remote. Nah, we're going to be partly flexible, somewhat hybrid, to actually some companies have come out and said to their employees, you have to be in the office this many days a week.
We won't
Whether the
name any
reasoning behind
names.
that is,
We won't say any
nope,
names.
not naming any names. Nope. But there are companies,
Yes.
I've seen it, that have come out and said, you have to be in the office X number of days a week. Some of them have even said, these are the days of the week that you have to be in the
Hmm.
office. And it's couched under the umbrella of innovation and collaboration and communication. And I'm not saying that those things don't happen more naturally, more organically and faster when you're face to face, but they we've clearly shown that you can make it work also when you're working virtually.
Hmm.
And if you have a distributed workforce, that's you need to figure out how to do that. But what I think is going to be the challenge, particularly for larger companies, is that's a lot of hard work. It's a big, heavy
Hmm.
lift. And it's easier, honestly, to just say, come back to the office because then things kind of happen naturally, organically, right? People figure out how to work, they figure out who they need to talk to, their networks get stronger because they're all hanging around. There's a lot less intentionality around it. And so I think that's the big challenge for a lot of organizations is unless you do the hard work of really understanding how your organization works, how your the different departments in your organization work with other departments, define some of those rules of engagement, and think about the processes that are really important to support everyone, you're going to have this mix. And what will be interesting, I think, as we go along is if you're mandating people to come back to the office, um, for three days a week, let's just say that, one, it creates some challenges in real estate. Like you cannot release any of your real estate in that,
Mm.
and you really can't make it to be super flexible and to support true collaboration, because on those days you're going to be at max capacity. So you have to have enough seats for everyone to be there because you've mandated it. I think the other challenge for that is you will have people that need a more flexible environment, whether that's because schools are still challenging and you're doing virtual learning, whatever that you might have elder care, whatever that looks like, you're you're going to have those situations for some of your employees. And so as organizations mandate that, I think and over the course of time, I think it'll be really interesting to watch the progression of careers. There's a lot of concern in the industry right now around um, if you're in the office and you're getting FaceTime, you're the one that's going to get promoted, right? I'm just going to call it out. There's questions about that. And so I think there is some questions from people around how do you manage in a virtual environment that progression? And my answer to that is one, your leaders have to walk the walk, right? Your leaders, if for us, one of the things that we've talked to our leaders is you guys can't come back to the office 100% of the time, even if that's your most comfortable way of working. You have to set the expectation and manage the standard. If you are coming in every day, then it trickles down and everybody feels like they have to come in every day,
Hmm.
right? So sometimes it's having those hard conversations with leaders around you're the role model for everybody else in the organization. And so you have to help manage and set the expectation of what we're trying to drive towards. But I think those are things that companies that aren't, for whatever reason, whether because their company's too big, they truly believe that they need the FaceTime to do it, or they just don't have the time and the resources right now to really focus on some of those fundamental things.
Hmm.
Those will be the things that really, I believe, will be game changers for hybrid work and companies that are thinking about doing hybrid work as we go down, you know, as we look into the future.
Mm. This is so interesting because I've been seeing, many fully remote companies in the past where, people didn't know how you were able to manage a fully distributed company. And in the end, then there is so much need of intention, as you say, on like, how are you going to design the organization for it to be able to work everywhere, different time zone? You really, really have to be thinking about the how of everything. And I think that actually these companies that experience remote work and then establish these new processes in their company just for that period of time for the past year and a half, and if they would want to decide to come back to the office and have a bit of a hybrid level, if they succeeded at that remote first approach of work, they will probably much more succeed at being hybrid once they will be moving back into the office just because of that reason, because there's so much organizational design to be done. That's mostly what I'm focusing on right now with my job. But I think that this is really where there's a big shift, and we used to think that, oh, how can they actually work together. But then these big companies that don't have the resources, as you say, to put it in place, it's a bit of a bummer because it's actually bringing a lot of value to the company in general to work better. Even if you decide to go back to the office 100% and be like, culturally we like to be better together all in the same office, but if you have this kind of distributed by design approach or remote first approach, like you're going to be much more efficient anyway. We won't have silos anymore. People will actually like know a little bit more of what's going on in the company. Like, I don't know for you, but like for me, my own experience of working where you can really feel in the office that there are silos and people are not talking to each other.
Yes.
And then once they go remote, they really, really struggle. This is what happened since last year. People have been struggling and realizing, oh, our processes are not really good. We have to like tackle them.
I think that it has really shown, again, that's what I say. That's why I mean the organizational design and how you think about work and how work gets done and how people engage and interact, which is all part of the culture of the organization, is inherently, in my mind, incredibly more important than the design of your space. The design of your space is important, and but it's inherently not the fundamental parts of how the organization gets work done and produces products and delivers services and things to your clients. It's really about the engagement and how people engage and how people um, work and get work done. And so I think the office, the physical office, and pre-pandemic, when most organizations, 90%, more than 90%, like 95% of organizations were all in office organizations, things could get overlooked because you came into the office every day. So if something didn't quite work right, you figured out how to work around it because you were in the office with those people every single day. And
Mm-hmm.
so whether that was you overheard a conversation, you saw something on a whiteboard, I mean, there was a lot of ways in which information sharing happened that was very organic, even if it wasn't intentional. And that's the big difference, I think, in the hybrid or the dynamic work environment is intentionality. And so I read a study not too long ago around one of the challenges of virtual working and distributed working is that you have two kinds of networks. You have your strong network, which is people on your team that you work with every single day and you talk with for the most part pretty regularly. And then you have your weak network, which is your a lot of times your cross-functional partners, people that aren't part of your team. They aren't necessarily people that you engage with every day, but they're people that when you're in the office, you might run into them, you might see them, you might chit chat with them. So you're fostering this like in this relationship with them, whether you actually have work product to do with them or not, so that when you do have work product to do with them, it's a very natural transition from, hey, we had lunch, we chatted, we just caught up, to, hey, we got something to work on. Can you work on this with me? It's very different in a virtual environment when you're doing that because you have to set intentional time to keep those connections, and it's harder. I mean, just if Adam Grant's one of my favorite folks to follow. He talks so much about organizational psychology and organizational design, and he talks a lot around human psychology and how we as the human culture, when you are by yourself, even if you're an intro you're extrovert, you tend your network shrinks. It just shrinks to the people that you need inherently to get work done. And I think there's tons of studies out there. Adam's done a number of them that really show the best ideas come from that diversity of thought and the diversity of engagements and people that you can engage with. And so, part of our role in thinking about dynamic work and our culture is how do we enable people to expand their network in particularly in the organization beyond just the people that you talk with and you do work with every single day, because those other people are going to give you insight. That's partly how we think innovation happens. And that's why I think a lot of companies are saying innovation happens when you're in the office. It's because of these serendipitous, casual collisions of people that you might run into in the cafe that you normally wouldn't talk to. And so now you're having this conversation about something that, you wouldn't have talked about before. There's just a lot of intentionality that has to happen when you aren't bringing everybody to the office every day. And it's a lot of work, and it's culturally, you have to redefine the culture of that's how we expect people to show up and how we expect people to work. And then you have to reward and recognize that so that you're reinforcing that behavior.
Mm. And how do you create a bit of that serendipity that you're talking about? You know, is there like tricks that you can maybe share for those who are trying to like build a bit of that feeling of networking in the company where instead of having everything being scheduled all the time?
So I think we're working on that. I don't have a good
Mm.
answer for you yet. I think one of the things that we're working on right now is actually an employee experience portal, which brings together not only information across the organization, but different resource groups. So employee resource groups, our Okta for Good, which is our philanthropic arm, but also does a lot of community events and supporting community by where our offices and non-offices are. And I think that by creating this employee experience portal where everyone has the same access, and it's a little bit different than a wiki, right? Because it's going to have some curated information on it, right? And it'll have here's the current goings on at Okta. Here's what's going on, outside of Okta. Here's what some of our customers are saying. And so you create this almost like a media feed where employees can engage with it individually on the things that are really important to them around their interests and the things that they're focused on. And so that's a little bit of how you create that serendipitous community, because now you have a place where everybody can come together. I can comment, or I can provide feedback, or I can share something that somebody else in the organization might find really interesting and want to be part of as well, but they didn't know who I am, or they hadn't, they didn't know my name, so they couldn't reach out on an email or Slack. And I think that's one of the ways that serendipity happens, is through intentionality of bringing together content and information, and communication, so that people can react to it based on their own personal values and the values of the company, and the things that they're interested in. And you create this network of people that you would never have known existed in Okta necessarily. Even if you went through our org wiki, or somebody told you about somebody else, it requires a level of again, intentionality to reach out to someone and say, hey, I'm this person, you're working on this, I'd like to talk to you about it. But if we have this portal where everybody can share information, and we have some curated information that comes from the organization, if someone comments on something that I find interesting, I'm like, oh, great, there's somebody else that thinks something is interesting like I do. So let's get together, let's have a conversation. And so I think there's some serendipity in how we think about the way that interaction and that engagement will happen. There's a ton of other tools that are out in the environment that
Mhm.
can create some serendipity. There's a lot of companies, virtual event tours. So for all of our company kickoffs this year, we did it as part of a virtual event gathering, with to some degree people had avatars, and so there's lots of conversations around how do you do it that way. So I mean, I think there's a lot of development in that space right
Mhm.
now. I don't think that anybody's truly figured it out, and we certainly haven't. We just have some ideas of things that we think will enable that first step of those serendipitous conversations, or casual collision conversations, people that you might not have known or part of the organization, or you might not have run into, right? Which you might have if you were in the office. If I'm walking with someone, and that 6 degrees of separation kind of thing. That's a little bit of what we're trying to create with this employee experience portal.
That's super interesting. So the portal is like a place where you have a bit of a directory of everyone, but you know a bit more about them, and you can also like converse in that platform. I would like to get a bit more info about that.
Yeah, I can share more about it when we're not quite at the place where we're ready to kind of talk about it,
Okay.
because we're still working through final requirements and what are the partners that we look like. But I would say it's, you could almost think about it like a modern intranet,
Mm.
for lack of a better term, or a modern, like almost like a community board for the organization, where there's targeted communications, there's calls to action, for things that have long lead times, and that are part of organizational design. And then you have these different um, subgroups, or sections within the platform where people can, yes, have conversations. Like I might post something about, like if I were to post this interview on our workplace site, right? People, I could send a note out and say, on that feed that says, hey, we have a new interview, go check it out. And then somebody might ask me a question about that I've never met before. A good example is we do an all hands every week here. And 2 weeks ago, I presented our plan for dynamic work. And from that, I had like 6 different Slacks, and I had 5 different emails of people that wanted to talk to me, that these people had never met me. They weren't even in my department, but without doing that, without giving some visibility to the work that we're doing, I don't know that they would have reached out. And so they might have kept going down their path, and we might have been doing duplicative work, or it might have been siloed work, or whatever we look like. So the goal of the employee experience platform and our rules of engagement and all of these different tools and processes are to provide visibility so people can engage in a very in some ways serendipitous, but in some ways intentional uh, methodology.
I really love it. I think if you, well, the day you're gonna launch this, and then if you write a post about it, I definitely will follow along, because this is, I think, super important at the moment in the industry to create that kind of like digital headquarter for your team. So definitely, we'll
That's a
follow.
great way to think about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Sam. It was so nice to have you. You've been sharing super insightful things to us today. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daphne. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to Remote First. You can find all links and show notes in the episode description. And if you found value in this show, we'd love your rating on your listening app of choice. Thank you for being here. See you next time.